There
we go, there they come. Good evening. We will just give it a couple of minutes for everyone to dial in and get into the meeting, and then we'll get started. Good evening. I see there's still a few participants that are signing in. I'll give it one more minute and then I'll get us started. Hi, I'm Hillian Daniels. I am the chair for the Brisbane branch. And I'd like to welcome you to our very first webinar that we've hosted, very first webinar that I've ever hosted. So please be patient if I do something wrong, press the wrong button, hopefully not, just be understanding. But the proceedings for this evening is that we'll just do a few housekeeping rules for this evening, and then we'll get into introducing the speakers and they'll take us through the session. At approximately 7:10, we'll wrap up and allow for an opportunity for questions and answers to be answered. You'll see you can on chat, you can put any of the questions that you have got to the speakers, and you're also able to poll somebody else's question if you had the same question. And Kita, who's one of our committee members, will then facilitate the Q&A with the speakers at about 7:10. If I can ask you all, I'm not sure I set this up, but I presume you are all on mute and not able to unmute yourself, but if this is not the case, please stay on mute so that everybody is able to hear the speakers and that there's no disruptions or echoes. And that's basically pretty easy. There's no evacuation, there's no all the other house rules we generally have, right? So sit back, listen, enjoy, and thank you for attending. Just a quick acknowledgement of country. IIBA Australia chapter acknowledges the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and culture. Brisbane branch acknowledges the First Nations people, We pay our respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Those are the Brisbane committee members. They all work very hard to bring events like this together. Normally we would have networking events in person. And thank you to my committee members for all the hard work that you've done to bring this event together. Just a quick, we currently have study groups across the country in Adelaide, Brisbane, Hobart, Perth, and Sydney. They are all being run virtually at this point in time. So if you are thinking of joining a study group, we have some that are coming up in Adelaide, Melbourne, and Perth. As they are all being run virtually, it doesn't really matter where you are situated. You are able to join any one of them. Just a thank you to all our supporters. Thank you to all the members that have made it possible to host events like this evening. Ooh, you see, that wasn't supposed to happen. I don't know why it did. Sorry. Thank you for all the support we've had. We've managed to, in a very short time, take our study groups online, and tonight we are hosting our first national online event. I knew I'd pressed the wrong button somewhere along the line. All right. Thank you, Leonardo, for sponsoring this evening, and we'll get straight into our speakers for today. We've got Professor Marcello La Rosa. He's the CEO and co-founder of Apromore, and Ian Edwards, consulting principal. I am going to hand the reins over to them, and thank you for coming, and we will wrap up at the end of the evening with some more key information around chapter activities.
Thank you very much, Eileen, and thank you to the Brisbane chapter for the invitation to talk a bit more about process mining and what we do with it. Please let me know if you can't see my screen. Otherwise, we are good to go. So before talking about what process mining is all about, we would like to introduce the idea why process mining came about in the first place. So why do we need process mining in the first place? So process mining as a discipline originated about 20 years ago from academic efforts. And it started from this very idea. It started from the observation that often there is a stark contrast between reality on the one hand and the way we picture the reality, the way we imagine it. We can see that in popular commercials, where sometimes we are exposed to, let's say, misleading pictures, but we can also see it when we run and describe our business operations. So when we model our business processes, we tend to represent them through simplified flowcharts. This is basically to handle, this is a mechanism to handle the complexity of these operations. However, on the other hand, the actual process that is performed in our organization may be far more complex than the way we represent it, for example, in the context of, in the form of a process model. We might have extra activities, for example, to fix defects or errors. So we might have reworks or repetition loops. We might have back and forths. We might have bottlenecks and all sort of types of performance and compliance issues. So why is this the case? Why do we have this stark difference between operations as we imagine them and operations as they are actually performed in reality? Well, there are at least a couple of reasons for that. First of all, as we know, these days exceptions are the rule. They are everywhere. Let's imagine a claims handling process in the context of an insurance process where the claim relates to a particularly exceptional type of damage that requires a complex procedure to be performed. Or look at the context of tertiary education. In a university, we have student admission. It's a very common process. It's quite affected these days during COVID. And there, we might have a student that is a transfer from an overseas university. So we need to figure out the conversion of the subjects that the students attended in that specific university with those that we offer here in our university. So exceptions are everywhere, and that is one reason why we tend to simplify reality by not representing exceptional paths in our process models. And the second reason, which is quite topical these days, is that the actual context in which our organization operates, the so-called business environment, tends to change, often unexpectedly, like in the case of COVID-19. So the result of these changes, which might be internally geopolicy change, or more broadly speaking, as I said before, contextual changes that involve the business environment, lead, whether we want it or not, to our processes being modified, often on the run, adapted to cope with these changes.
Yeah, and I think there's another angle to these context changes, which can be both conscious and unconscious for businesses. So when we think about the overall operating model of a number of businesses, consciously a period of time like now can force a business to make some very, very conscious changes about their operating model, the way in which they interact with the market, or with their customers. And obviously from an ability to understand what would that change in operating model actually mean to the business, the upstream, the downstream, all of the processes. There's a very strong need for data-driven decision-making when you're making a conscious change. The second way this tends to manifest, and especially in a period of time like now, is the unconscious change. So the unconscious changes that come from not seeing the business context changes until they start to manifest themselves down the track in the results. So once again, the ability to be able to see the effect that a process is having on the business and being able to pick up those changes so that they cease to become unconscious, and you can make some very, very clear decisions about what to do with these processes.
Thank you, Ian. So how do we handle this with traditional business process management methods? Well, what we do is that we embark in a long journey, the so-called BPM life cycle, where we identify the processes that are in need to be fixed because, for example, they are affected by performance or compliance issues. And then we start discovering them by running workshops, engaging process participants in interviews or focus groups with the aim of creating these process models. And then these process models should work as an enabler for the subsequent phases of the life cycle, where we can analyze, redesign, implement changes, and so on. But often we get stuck in this excruciatingly long and labor-intensive modeling exercise. And as we've seen in our experience, organizations, especially large groups, tend to collect over time large quantities of process models in so-called process model repositories. The problem is that, as I was saying before, these models are hard to maintain, are hard to keep up to date with reality. So we tend to neglect them and focus maybe on updating only a subset of them, especially when you consider organizations that keep over 3,000 or 4,000 process models, like Suncorp, a large insurance group here in Australia. So we tend to neglect most of them and only focus on a project by project basis on a portion, on a subset of this model. So what is the result of that? Is that we tend to get stuck in this very initial phase of the BPM life cycle, unable to move on into the subsequent phases, and hence unable to reap the benefits of business process improvement. So we tend to collect large collections of that process models.
And the other downside of that approach to BPM is that given the time that it takes to do that discovery, and given the labor-intensive nature of building out these maps and models, we do also tend to stop at the happy path. So you have a lot of organizations with 3,000 or 4,000 models of the happy path, with not a lot of exceptions, not a lot of alternate scenarios mapped, because there is so much work required to uncover and discover all of the exceptions and all of those extraordinary paths, that we tend to focus on the happy path, which then obviously has other downstream issues.
And this is precisely the context in which process mining nests itself. And the idea of process mining is basically to preach a paradigm shift in business process management from confidence-based BPM, the confidence given by the process stakeholders that we interview or engage in workshops, to an evidence-based approach where the evidence is provided by the data that is available within the organization. So the starting point of process mining is to tap into transactional data that these days is automatically recorded by the information systems available within our organization. Think of a CRM system for managing sales pipes, or an ERP system like SAP or Dynamics to manage our sales, procurement, or HR processes. All these systems record on a daily basis a vast amount of transactional data that goes by the name of event logs. So this transactional data, whether that is historical data that refers to processes that whose cases have completed, like orders that relate to the last 6 months, or claims that have been handled in the last 3 months, or whether this is live data that comes from a live stream of events and relates to the cases of the process that are as they unfold, like all the claims that we are currently handling, or all the orders that we are currently fulfilling. Basically, historical or live data, this is the starting point for process mining. We feed this data into a set of process mining algorithms to automatically extract what we call actionable process knowledge. So it is an intimate understanding of the underlying business process that is supported by the system. So we try to gain an understanding of the order to cash process as it is effectively performed in our organization, or a procure to pay, or a claims handling, or a loan origination process, right? Depending on the context. And it is actionable because whenever we identify issues, we can also at the same time identify remedial actions that allow us to rectify these issues. And this knowledge can take different forms. First and foremost, it takes actually the form of a process model that can be automatically reverse engineered from this transactional data. And the nice thing of this process model is that it comes with a range of statistics that are automatically extracted from the log. What you see here is a very simple example of an issue to resolution process. It could be to repair some equipment, a piece of equipment, or it could be to fix an error or to manage an incident in the context of service industry, right? So regardless of the context, the idea is that you go through a number of activities, and the process that we discover through process mining techniques, different than that we would have otherwise modeled by hand, has a few interesting characteristics. First of all, we can see all the activities and all the paths, not only the sunny day scenarios, but also the so-called uncommon behavior, the exceptions, right? In this example, you see in darker blue the boxes that represent frequent activities. And in light blue, you see those boxes that represent activities that are performed less frequently. Not in all the cases of this process. Likewise, with the arcs, you see the transitions from one activity to the activity that has been observed being executed immediately next within your data set. Again, the thicker the arc, the more frequent that particular transition has occurred in reality. The less thick, the thinner is the arc, the more infrequent is that particular passage. So at the same time, you can get a complete snapshot of reality. You can put together both the sunny day scenario, the most frequent path, as well as all the exceptions, for as complex as they may look like. And you see that there are some numbers here, and without going into the details, that's basically a frequency overlay. The nice thing of process mining tools is that you can automatically overlay a range of statistics that are automatically extracted from the log. Like we can see how often a given activity or a given transition between activities has been observed. So you see that this is a very punctual, up-to-date a picture of reality. And you can get a low-level diagram, so to say, like a process map, like the one shown in the slide, but you can also lift it up to a higher level of granularity by automatically turning that process map into a BPMN model. And for those who are familiar with process modeling languages, BPMN is a standard language that is used for representing business processes. And the advantage of discovering a BPMN model as opposed to a process map is that you will automatically identify these diamonds, which are basically the routing gateways to determine a precise order in which the various activities are performed. For example, you're able to distinguish activities that exclude each other, like confirm versus reject orders, versus activities that are actually performed in parallel, like ship goods and raise invoice.
And then, of course, you know, as BAs, when you start to have the ability to skip the arduous task of discovering these models and, you know, investigating and talking to people and mapping, the process for BAs starts by uploading this data straight into the tool. And the first step you're doing once you've cleaned that data and uploaded it is simply walking straight into the analysis. So from a BA's perspective, the time saving and the benefit to being able to get straight into analysing these patterns, analysing the different variations and the scenarios and so on, is wonderful. The next thing that obviously comes off the back of this is the ability to use this tool to understand then the social networks between that are running in this process. And the tool will automatically show you the flow of this process, but in terms of the roles or the participants within this process. So you can then start to see the relationships between both tasks and roles, or tasks and people, but also people and people. And this is where we can start to see patterns emerging as to certain tasks that are performed always by a certain role, and the next task along that is performed by a certain role. So we might be able to see things like approval processes or payments being made and payments being approved. But through this and being able to dial up and down the level of detail and the level of granularity, you can start to see patterns emerge whereby we might see, you know, in most of the cases, follow our process that we expect, where the payment is processed by X and approved by Y. We also might be able to then see the minor scenarios, which might be hiding some things like fraud or some regulation non-compliance, where people might be either paying out before it's approved or being approved by the same user, or potentially being approved by a user that we don't expect to. So this ability to be able to automatically discover the relationships between tasks and participants is also very strong.
So that is the first category of process mining techniques. So techniques that allow us to automatically discover a process model. And as Ian said, that process model can take itself different shapes. It can be a low-level process map. It can be an activity-centric process model represented in BPMN. It could be a social network of interactions between individuals or between their roles. Or it could even be a business object life cycle, where, for example, we could discover the various stages a given order or loan application goes through. And again, whether there are problems in the transitions between stages. The second category...
Sorry, mate, before you move on, I should probably mention as well that there is another functionality there that's related to the process discovery, which is more around simulation. So at the end of the day, you can start to look at designing a new process whereby traditionally we would, map it out on paper and decide what we wanted to do with this process. But with the simulation part of this tool set, we can also then start to build up a simulated data set so that we can test a simulated data set, whether it's over a quarter or a few months or 6 months or a year worth of data, to see the effect of our design on what is likely to happen upstream and downstream. So the ability to then simulate and be able to see and add in variables like the arrival rates of cases, the resourcing volumes and the resourcing distributions, and our business rules and our expected proportions in which they are executed, starts to give us a really good picture as we design something new as to what we can expect.
Thank you, Ian. So moving on, another category of techniques relate to the mining of performance. So process mining allows us to extract a range of statistics related to the performance of the processes that are being recorded in these systems. And we showed frequency before, but given that each event in our dataset is time-stamped, so we know at least when each activity within a given case of a process is completed, we can use that information to extract, for example, statistics related to the duration of activities and the durations of the waiting times between the completion of an activity and the beginning of the subsequent activity. So what you see here on the slide is the same process maps and BPMN models that we showed a couple of slides earlier, but this time we're using a different color gradation, a gradation of maroons, to indicate the average duration. And we picked average duration, but we could have chosen a different measure, for example, mean, max, median duration, or total duration. So each task now is showing its average duration as it has been observed in the log. And the darker the red color, the longer is that average duration. We can see that the activity repair complex is the one that takes on average the longest. It's about 23 minutes in this example, as opposed to other activities like test repair that last just a bunch of minutes, or inform user or archive repair, which are instant, probably because these are already automated activities performed by some application. And likewise, on the arcs, we can see the average waiting time between the end of a task and the beginning of the subsequent task. Again, the thickness of the arc represents waiting times that are longer. So this statistics overlay that focuses on durations allows us to identify certain types of anomalies in our business process. We can identify, for example, tasks that constitute bottlenecks because they just take too long than what is tolerable, as well as patterns where we see a given task that per se might not last that long, but all incoming arcs into this task are actually quite long. That means that we are facing a resource capacity issue. The task per se doesn't last long, but you don't have enough people to perform that particular task. So all the cases queue up at the doorstep of that task, waiting for a person to become available to perform it. So in essence, you can use this performance overlay to identify different performance anomalies that affect your process. So you see that from the discovery, we switched nearly naturally and instantaneously to the analysis phase of BPM, where we are already using the as-is model as a starting point for analysis. And there are different ways in which you can show the statistics. You can use an overlay directly on top of activities and arcs in your process model, or you could create custom dashboards where you look at the results at your performance statistics on an aggregate statistical level. For example, you could look at the distribution of cases over time, or the distribution of resources, or the frequency of activities, and use this again to gain insights into the performance of your process. So moving on, another interesting category of techniques for process mining goes under the name of conformance checking. The idea is to be able to gain a conformance report, which is basically a detailed understanding of the differences between a modeled process, an expected or normative process, as we have created it in the organization, versus the actual process that we have mined from the log. And if we take as input a BPMN model that might be available within the organization, again, as I said, a normative, an industry standard model, then we can use it to automatically identify discrepancy between this model and the one that we discover from our log. And these discrepancies may be identified at a structural level. For example, we might find that we have extra activities like inform user or restart repair that are not supposed to be there, or extra arcs like ping pong effects, rework and repetitions, loops that again we do not observe in our simple normative specification. But the differences may also be at a performance level. For example, we might have an expectation that our repair cases should be completed within 8 hours, while in reality we find out that the average is 18 hours with peaks of up to 3 or 4 days. So we can carry out a comparison both at the structural level as well as a performance level. And basically the idea of conformance checking is to highlight potential non-compliance issues, potential violations to internal policies or to regulatory requirements. And the idea of process mining is that it really empowers us with analytics that allow us to find these differences at the lowest level possible, at the level of individual activities and ordering of activities, as opposed to just an aggregate statistical level, like, it should take 8 hours and it takes 18 hours. And there are different ways, again, in which you can look at the results of conformance checking. In this particular example, we have imported in our tool, a Promore, we have imported a BPMN model that defines a normative specification. And then the tool automatically checks this against the log and overlays discrepancies, deviations from the normative model that originate from the log directly on top of this model. For example, we see that in reality, after test repair, sometimes instead of archiving the repair, we have to analyze the defect and inform the user because the defect was not rectified.
And of course, the other context of conformance checking is more than around compliance with, as Marcello said, the business rules and legislative regulatory requirements. I think when I start to look at models in this way, you can then start to look not only as to whether the process has followed the rule or the legislation or the regulation, but from a compliance perspective, but then start to look from a practicality perspective. Is this process following a compliant path, but is it a practical process? Is it actually slowing things down? Is it a necessary rule? So you can also look at conformance from the purview of efficiency and effectiveness, and whether or not those business rules should be changed, or if they're not so critical in terms of legislative or regulatory requirements, whether or not they're actually slowing your process down.
Thank you, Ian. Another category is that of variant analysis. The idea is actually to use filtering to segregate different sublogs that refer to different variants of our process. We know that in reality, each process often manifests itself in different variants. You know, we might have variants based on a geographic area, for example, different states here in Australia, or based on type of customer, type of product, amount of repayment, etc., etc. So the idea is to identify these variants from the data set and then segregate the data, separate the variants by generating separate sublogs, 2 or more, and use this as a starting point to extract, automatically discover a process model out of each of these sublogs, and then contrast this model with each other in order to identify differences and understand root causes for such differences. Here on the slide, you see an example where we took that repair process that we showed before, and we identified 2 different variants based on the type of repair. At the top, you see the model that relates to simple repairs. At the bottom, you see the one that refers to complex repairs. So you can use this as a starting point to detect differences. What are the key differences that determine the path that the repair request follows, whether it is simple or complex. And here I'm using a logical driver, but we could have well used a performance driver. For example, separating the fast cases, those that perform within the service level agreement of, say, 2 days with the client, versus those that take longer than 2 days to be completed. So fast versus slow. And then we compare these positive deviations versus the negative deviations in order to identify the statistically significant differences between these. And by studying these differences, we can understand the root causes. Why certain claims take longer than 2 days to be performed? Why certain repairs get stuck for weeks before we can get back to the client? So these are some of the questions that a variant analysis exercise like this can help you answer.
Certainly for processes where they're spread across different geographic regions, where they have different customer segments involved in that process, where there are different products or different time ranges, those types of variants can also be and filtered out and look at the effect of the same process across. In one example we've looked at recently, 5 different processing plants spread across the eastern seaboard. So exactly the same process across those 5 different plants look very, very different. And then you can start to overlay the different types of products, the different quality of products coming into those plants, the different types of outputs, the different staffing numbers, and start to see the most optimal flows. But that variant analysis is very, very simple. You can also then start to see for every variant the proportion of every variant against the total number of cases. So even if your process has 500 variants, you'll see every one of those 500 with its proportion against the total. And you'll also then be able to click down to see for each variant, you can actually see the specific process flow related to that variant. So then you can start to say, okay, here's my most common process. It happens 64% of the time, and then click down and see exactly the process model that represents that variant. Similarly, you can go down to the other end and say, here are all the 1%ers. Here are the flows that relate to that. And then you can start to identify what makes those only the 1%ers. Do we accept those or do we not accept those as being a valid flow? And then obviously within those less frequent variants, you can then start to see scenarios that either might be, you know, hiding parts of your business that you might not know about, or it might be hiding scenarios that people are trying to hide on purpose. So certainly within that variant analysis, you can get down to a granular level of detail that you would never see from a traditional model. The other beauty of the variance is you can start to pick a time element. So you can say, give me only those processes that fit within start and finish within a certain time period, or give me all of the cases across this process that finish by a certain time, or alternatively, give me every process variant that starts from a certain time, or give me everything that was in progress during this time range. So that there's a lot of options as to how you can start to identify your subsets of data. But as Marcello mentioned, saving these multiple logs and being able to then very quickly stack on top of one another multiple different versions of the process is a very powerful way of showing variances within the business.
Thank you, Ian. And again, also for variant analysis, there are different ways in which you can output the results. It could be in the form of process models that you then compare with each other, one per variant, but it could also be in the form of charts that you can build on demand based on the aspect or aspects of your process you are most interested in comparing. For example, here, I can see a difference between those two variants, simple versus complex repairs, but from the viewpoint of the resources and their workload. So I can see the distribution of resource workload for one variant versus the other. And I can see that those two curves, those two distributions follow two different curves. So basically the way resources are being utilized is quite different between the simple and the complex repairs. And there is also another way in which you can identify differences between variants. Instead of looking at a static snapshot, you can take the historical data and replay them on top of the process model that you've discovered. What you see here is an example of an animation where each token represents a specific case that was performed based on the historical data that we have at our hand. That is colored differently. In blue, we see the complex repairs. In red, we see the simple repairs. So basically, we animate these two logs on top of the same process model, and then we can observe differences in the dynamic behavior of these variants. So we might find that while a particular path, looking on paper at the process model, is in common to both variants, in reality that path is very infrequently performed in one variant and very frequently performed in the other, for example, leading to congestions. So we can also see whether we have some behavioral anomalies that we experience in one variant and not in the other. And the ability to replay history, so this is different than simulation, which is what Ian was alluding to beforehand, right? In simulation, you play out different what-if scenarios. With replay, you actually replay history, like the VAR in soccer, or the replay that we've seen at the Australian Open, right? So you basically it's like a live action replay of the past. And especially when you do it in the context of a comparative analysis, it allows you to see differences dynamically when they actually occurred. So for example, you can use this to profile the formation, evolution, and dissolution of a bottleneck over time, over the time frame of your data set.
And obviously obviously from a business perspective, being able to show especially decision makers and process owners, playing back their process to them can help to obviously visualize what's going on in the business much more than maybe the anecdotal evidence that they might have. But in terms of that as well, it allows us to see the inefficiencies that may be hidden by either scale or just simply by the volume that's going through that business. So the bigger the business, in my experience anyway, the bigger the business, the more risk there is that there are hidden inefficiencies hidden by that scale. So these types of analyses can start to uncover a lot of those hidden parts of the business. And also by showing these types of variants, you can start to remove maybe some of the emotion and the cognitive bias that goes along with showing the business back or playing back the business their own process, and start to cut through some of that initial defensiveness about what might be going on in the business and show them facts.
Thank you, Ian. Yes, in our experience, when we show these videos, then you see that there is a wow effect because you can't hide the evidence, right? And once, of course, you verified that you started from the right data set and the right assumptions, then you're basically facing evidence in action, right? So there are different ways in which you can carry out variant analysis. Before, we showed basically a comparison between two different variants of the same process, e.g. two types of products or geographical areas. But another way of using variant analysis is in the specific context of change analysis. So you take now the log and you divide it chronologically in different intervals. For example, you have a couple of milestones there, before COVID and after COVID. And you want to see how your process was enacted before the first milestone, so before the crisis, during the crisis, in between the two milestones, and after the crisis was over. And you can basically study how your organization has reacted, has coped with a particular change. And again, in the case of COVID, was a change coming from the external environment, right, in which the organization operates. So we call this change analysis or evolution analysis. And it's a sort of retrospective into how we have been operating, how we have been reacting over time. And it is also possible to use process mining techniques to automatically detect these milestones, which are called drifts, meaning statistically significant changes in the way our process behaved over time. So even if we are not aware of these changes, we might use process mining techniques to automatically detect these drifts.
And of course, some of the changes that might be posed upon a business, like on the picture on the screen there, you know, the processes that in most businesses that be operating now might be cut down, they might be streamlined. Now that might be much more efficient. It might be a hell of a lot more risky. And so I think, once again, getting back to conscious decision making, you know, this was our process before. We had a number of reloops, as you can see in that top picture. We had a lot more flows. We had a lot more scenarios. We then simplified. We then went to a process whereby we can enact this maybe remotely. We've changed our business rules. Is that the best way for our business to run, or should we be going back to the before, or should we be adopting a hybrid? And the same goes for things like assessing your disaster recovery process or any sort of process that's been largely affected. Once again, it's conscious decision making about what elements do we keep, which elements do we amend, and which ones do we throw in the bin.
Thank you, Ian. Finally, when we use process mining to tap into live data, we can generate a series of predictions to basically anticipate and potentially and possibly avoid problems that may arise in the near future. So we talk about predictive and prescriptive monitoring, which is a sub-area of process mining that specifically looks at live data. So the idea is to offer support beyond the analysis of our processes based on historical data for long-term improvement, but rather to offer operational support as cases of our process unfold. For example, we tap into a live stream coming out of our SAP system and relating to all our procure-to-pay processes. And we can use this incoming stream of events to create a series of, to train a series of predictive models in order to issue a runtime predictions as to the future of each of our purchase requests. While we process each request, we may be able to predict how long it's going to take for the purchase request to be handled. We might predict the performance of the various suppliers that we are being served by. We might rank the suppliers on the basis of their predicted performance. So whether it is a number that we are after, like for example predicting the remaining time, or whether that is an outcome, for example predicting whether the applicant is going to accept or reject the loan offer, all these predictions can be used to foresee and, when in need, anticipate problems, avoid problems from happening. For example, we might support a claims manager in the context of a claims handling process in an insurance company to predict whether the open claims are going to be completed within the SLA agreement of 5 working days or not, so that this manager can focus on those claims that are at highest risk, that have the highest risk of violating the SLA. And of course, the earlier we are able to provide a prediction to the manager, the more time this person has to undertake remedial actions. So basically what you can do is that you can use these predictions as a starting point to build a recommender system that can offer recommendations to the manager as to what actions to take next in order to avoid problems from arising. For example, move a such and such claims handlers from this claim that is pretty safe to these other claims that is very close or it has a very high likelihood of violating the SLA with that client for that particular policy type, a claim policy type. And so what is the outcome of predictive monitoring? It's a dashboard that you can build and then feed with live data runtime to issue predictions about the future, the near future of cases for operational support. Like this is an example of an organization we worked with, and it is in the context of a procure-to-pay process where they wanted to predict the performance in terms of on-time delivery of different suppliers based on their location and the delivery type, like sea or courier, and the sector, high-tech, manufacturing. In other contexts, like insurance, we use it to predict the remaining time of a claim, the amount of the repayment, the likelihood of violating SLAs, for example, at 30 or 60 days, and the most likely continuation of a case, which can be used for scheduling purposes, so for resource allocation.
There are other uses for this. I mean, these dashboards can obviously be configured. So the metrics up the top obviously can suit the business need. But one of the other main use cases we're trying to work with one of the other customers on is actually then trying to predict the quality of the incoming product from their suppliers. So even moving away from their process, even though they've got some concepts around process predictive models, but then trying to predict based upon the history of the geographic region that they were sourcing products from, the season in which they sourced it, the products that were supplied, the previous quality, trying to then be able to show that if we buy from X supplier in this month from this geography, then we're likely to see a quality ratio of X. And that's the other side of this, that your data can start to provide you, obviously based upon how much data you capture in your core systems.
Thank you, Ian. So let's wrap up what we've seen so far. And let's look again at these techniques, but this time from a viewpoint of the strategic objectives we are after. So basically, if we've talked about where process mining came from and the what of process mining, so what techniques are at our disposals, now let's wrap up with a bit of why. Why can we, so what are the reasons for using process mining, or what can we do with process mining? So here we've just put together 5 key value enablers of process mining. As you have understood by now, the first value is transparency, right? So process mining allows us to get a closer look, evidence-based, into the assist process, so to achieve transparency into our operations. And we can do that through techniques from automated process discovery, like automatically reverse engineering a process map, a BPMN model, a social network, and so on. And then transparency itself works as an enabler for other values. For example, we might use process mining to gain operational efficiency. For this, we might enhance our process model with performance overlays to identify bottlenecks related to activities that take too long or resource capacity issues. Or we might profile the performance of our process by means of charts, so using an aggregate statistical level in a custom dashboard. Or we might even replay historical data on top of our process model to identify anomalies on a dynamic level. Another value that we can achieve with process mining is that of quality, like improving the quality of services and hence the experience of the customer. For this, we can use techniques like filtering, where we segregate different variants, and we can then do a contrast analysis or variant analysis between the different variants. We can compare them on a model-to-model level, or we can do a multi-log animation, as we saw before in the example, where we replay cases related to multiple variants at once. Or we can compare variants on a statistical level. So what are we after here? We want to compare cases where, say, the customer had a good experience, so those that met the SLA, that were completed on time, versus those that took too long to be completed. And from these differences, we want to understand the root causes for these differences, right? Because we are after removing such differences wherever there is possible. Then we also talked about conformance checking, and more broadly, we can use conformance checking techniques for addressing problems relating to governance, risk, and compliance. So we can use rule-based filtering. For example, look for cases that violate a 4I principle, where the invoice should be authorized and paid by 2 different financial officers. Or we can do a model-based conformance checking, where we check a normative BPMN model with a model that we automatically extract from our law. And last but not least, we can also use process mining for agility. For example, we can use simulation by simulating different what-if scenarios on top of the Aziz process model, change analysis, where we look at the evolution of our process over time, or predictive and prescriptive monitoring to react as quickly as possible to changes from the context in which the process operates. Right, so we have a case study that perhaps, given the time, we can try to cover quite quickly on a high level and try to finish by 7 and then open the floor for some questions, if that's okay. And given that you are all muted, I take it as an okay. Right, so some years ago we did a case study with Suncorp, and while this case already has a few years, it is interesting because the company allowed us to follow them throughout their journey, well beyond process mining. So we first applied process mining, and then the organization took the results of this process mining project as a starting point to identify some improvement actions. They redesigned their process, and then they implemented the new process design, and we could basically witness the benefits that they managed to achieve out of this project. So it's an interesting case in the literature, and that's why we would like to discuss it. The case specifically refers to commercial claims handling processes. So back then, we looked at about 130,000 claims related to commercial insurance. And what you see here is an actual plot of commercial claims performance that was provided to us from Suncorp. What you see is that on the x-axis, you see the complexity of the claim. A simple claim might be, for example, a laptop from your employer that breaks down. A complex claim may be an entire warehouse that burns down, right? So clearly the severity of the claims is also determining the amount of the repayment and the type of policy attached to that particular claim. And on the y-axis, you see the duration. Right, and also there is a threshold represented by this horizontal line. So basically you have fast claims, those that are completed within an SLA of, say, 5 days, and slow claims, which are those that take longer than 5 days to be completed. Now, what you see on this plot is that each of these dot is basically a claim that has a given severity level or complexity level, and it took a given amount of time to complete. And what you see here with this blue line is basically the expected performance. You would expect to have a strong correlation between the complexity of the claim and its duration. So the more complex the claim, the longer it should take to be completed. However, you see that there is hardly any correlation between these two dimensions. In fact, you see that if on the one end you've got some claims that are complex and clearly take longer than 5 days to be completed, and that's expected, that is okay. Or you see on the bottom left quadrant that there is a large number of simple claims that took less than 5 days to be completed, so they are okay. And on the bottom right quadrant, you even see a handful of outliers. These are complex claims that completed within 5 days. You see that the problem is actually on the top left quadrant. You see that the great majority of claims are simple, yet they take longer than 5 days to be completed. So the objective of the compact was to push all these claims down from the top left to the bottom left quadrant, because it was clearly too expensive to handle for such long time these low value, high volume claims. And clearly this had negative ramifications on customer experience, besides the company being subjected to fining from the regulator for this large number of SLA violations. So we undertook a process mining exercise, and specifically we used techniques from variant analysis. So the idea was to filter out all the cases that relate to complex claims and rather focus on the simple claims. And we extracted two sublogs, one that refers to the simple claims that were performed within the 5 days SLA versus another sublog that refers to the simple claims that actually took longer than 5 days to be completed. We automatically reverse engineered a process model out of each of these two log variants, and then we did a comparison between these two models. And what you see here is a simple ABC style example. In reality, the models were more complex, but the idea is that basically we identified a couple of key differences between the slow and the quick cases. In fact, these differences were related to a couple of rework loops. One where the organization was seeking more information from the claimant, and the other was actually related to various activities performed by the claim senders where there was a bit of back and forth between the various handlers. We backed up that visual analysis with a statistical analysis of the repetitions, and we found out that in specific phases of this process, there were activities that were performed up to 12 times in the slow variant, as opposed to being performed only once in the fast variant. There was another piece of evidence about where the differences were. But the most convincing analytic that we extracted was actually a replay of the historical cases. So what you see here is actually the process the process model that we automatically extracted from Suncorp. And we took this model from the entire log, so including both slow and fast claims. Then we replayed the historical data, and we showed different attributes, different characteristics of our data set. So for example, first of all, we looked at the severity of the claim. So we used a color scale, a color gradation to indicate the complexity of the claim, also known as claim size. From a gray color that represents a simple claim all the way to a red color that represents a complex claim. And in reality, there is more than simple versus complex, it's actually different levels. Now, each of these circles represents an accumulation of claims that get stuck in a particular point in our process. And as you see, the predominant color is gray. So now we change the analytics, and with the color, we represent the length, the time a given claim gets stuck in a particular point in our process. The darker the color, the longer the claim gets stuck. The larger the radius of the circle, the larger the number of claims that get stuck in a particular point of the process. And as you've seen from these circles engrossing themselves, there was really an explosion of claims that got stuck in two particular points in our process. And this relates to these two loops that I referred to before. The first one, where the company was seeking more information from the claimant in piecemeals, little by little. And the second one is actually a more articulated loop. And what we found is that there was actually a back and forth, a ping-pong effect between different claimants. And that was related to the way the performance bonus was defined, which was not in line with the way the performance bonus was defined at the process level for the executive manager. So in a nutshell, the company decided to undertake 3 remedial actions. First, they changed the application front end to avoid claim handlers to really play this back and forth game of working a bit on a claim and pushing it back onto the queue, working on another claim and pushing it back onto the queue. Then they fixed the triaging so that they could ask all the information at once by front loading the process at the beginning. And finally, they decided to outsource the low value claims overseas so that they could even gain a higher level of efficiency by further reducing cost. And the nice thing, as I said, is the actual benefits that they got. First of all, there were a number of indicators of customer experience that improved systematically over a period of time. There was a cost reduction quantified into a 30% reduction of resources that could be allocated into the complex claims where they would add more value. And finally, the handling time was reduced from an average of 1 to 2 months down to 5 days. So there were some significant cost savings and improvements in customer experience, and it all started from a process mining exercise. Another lesson learned of this case study is that, as you can see, process mining is a starting point, but it is not the answer to all our questions. It basically equips us with the instruments to identify and rectify issues. Then it's up to us to follow the project through to the end by implementing changes and monitoring that these changes are allowing us to achieve our performance targets. Right, so I would like to close it with that, unless Ian, you have any further remark.
No, I think it's probably questions.
And before getting to the questions, I would like to quickly announce that next Wednesday, we have another seminar organized by Leonardo, where we will actually see some of these techniques in practice in the context of the Apromore tool. Thank you very much for your time and interest.
Thank you, Marcello, and thank you, Ian. I think it was quite an interesting presentation. We have 35 odd questions that our attendees have raised. I would like to say that we have 15 minutes before we wrap up today's session, so we would not be able to answer all the questions. Having said that, we will try to cover as much themes as we can. So there are a few common questions around, how would you capture the manual elements in a process which are not usually available through system logs, and also for big companies where processes are not really documented well, how do you go about collecting the processes in the first place?
So when it comes to extracting data from for the sake of process mining, most of the benefits that we can achieve most benefits if we are able to fully capture the end-to-end process, right? So if this process spans different systems, then we need to extract data from different systems. However, if there are also gaps in the data recording, because some steps have been performed manually outside of a system that is equipped with a logging mechanism, then of course our analysis will be partial. So there is no black magic. Basically, if there are gaps, we can model this, for example, in the context of a process modeling tool. But if we are after analyzing the performance of this, then unless we have the data, we can't really cover these gaps. However, recently, we have been experimenting with a new category of tools that can actually automatically build so-called UI logs. So basically what we can do for those activities that run outside of an enterprise system like, SAP or Dynamics, we can install an agent in the computer of the employee and automatically record user interactions. For example, we did this at the University of Melbourne by automatically recording manual tasks related to the transfer of student records from an Excel spreadsheet to a web form. So once we have these UI logs, then we can integrate it with the logs coming from the enterprise systems and then use this as input, this integrated log as input for process mining techniques.
Sounds good. The other question is then around what are the key softwares and tools available to enable process mining and also capturing or producing the maps itself in the market?
So, we have been developing our own process mining tool, BIC Process Mining by Apromore. It is actually an integration of our own process mining tool Apromore with the BIC ecosystem. And as you can see, this particular seminar was actually sponsored by BIC. So then basically, in a tool like BIC, you can see process mining capabilities integrated with process modeling, process automation, process monitoring capabilities, all integrated in a single system. So there's a variety of tools out there, and each tool has different characteristics. When it comes to our own tool, one key characteristic is that Apromore directly derives from the efforts of our own research. So it's really state of the art. I read a question before that was about the quality of the BPMN model that is automatically discovered from the log. So first of all, this transition from process map to a BPMN model in BIC Process Mining by Apromore is dynamic and fully automated. And the quality is very high because, as I was mentioning before, every single algorithm that is embedded in the tool directly comes from our own research, from a PhD thesis or from a number of papers. So the specific BPMN mining algorithm is called split miner, and we've done a benchmark and comparative analysis with all the other algorithms available out there and shown that split miner has the highest accuracy and is the most efficient one. So this is, I mean, there are other differentiating factors, but given the time, if I need to mention one, that would be leading edge, directly coming from our own research.
Thank you. Next question is for you, Ian, considering you've been working across industries and domains as a consultant. So can you throw light on where do you see process mining being adopted, specifically in Australia? Which are the industries which would see a lot of adoption of process mining?
Look, in a general sense, anybody doing transformation projects and data-driven decision-making, but more specifically manufacturing, finance, government, and regulation. So there are obviously applications for this across basically universally, but most of those industries that I mentioned are either embarking on data-driven transformations or are needing to do that to keep up, but particularly in terms of government services, particularly in terms of manufacturing, where pressures are coming on their decision-making and they don't have the leeway. We were talking about business models before, and one of the manufacturing companies we are working with have had to make some very conscious decisions about moving from a very consultative model where they're very open and transparent with the market, their competitors, their customers, to being almost on a war footing to get through not only drought and supply downturns, but then obviously impact of consumer changes. So, but particularly, as I said, manufacturing, government, regulation, and finance are probably one of some of the key industries that I would have said.
Thank you so much. Then there are a lot of questions actually around getting the data itself, which is challenging. So if you can throw light on, how would you get transactional data for an automated process discovery? And if there is an example that you can run us through with, there's a generic question, how do you get the data in big companies which might not have records or process maps, directories?
Sure. Let's take a quick look at the anatomy of an event log. There are three key ingredients that we need when it comes to performing a process mining exercise. So first of all, we need to have the case identifier. So that is basically a unique ID of each case. That could be the order number, the purchase request number, the claims ID number. We also need to have a reference to the activity of the process. That could be a label or could be an ID. So what was the activity that was performed? And at least a timestamp of completion. When was that activity completed within that case? Any further attributes like the start timestamp, the resource who did the activity, the requested amount, and offered amount, or the loan goal in the context of the loan origination process in this particular example, that can all be used to extract richer analytics. For example, for variance analysis, we might use the loan amount to differentiate between small and large loans. Now, this data may be available all in a single table, or it might be spread over different tables. This is the case of Salesforce or SAP, for example. So what we need is an algorithm to be able to extract data from different tables and then join them on the basis of the common keys, right? And there are now established algorithms that are embedded in so-called connectors that allow us to automatically connect to the source systems and ingest the data. But this is when we are talking about an out-of-the-box process supported by a standard system. Sometimes we face case situations where we have a custom system. So we need to manually extract this log, and this might be a trial and error process until we find all the required ingredients. And once we've done that and carried out the analysis, then at that stage, if we want to systematize this analysis, then we can build an algorithm that can automatically extract this data and consolidate it. So basically what we are doing is carrying out an ETL pipeline. So an extract, transform, and load pipeline. So there is no escape to that, as there is no escape to poor quality, to poor data quality problems, but there are ways of handling, ways of getting around that.
The simplicity of the data, once you've got those elements, is simply a CSV file, which uploads straight into the tool set. So remarkably simple to upload. Even when case IDs aren't necessarily unique, we've done things like concatenating 3 fields together to create a case ID that is unique across numerous data sets, which makes piecing together, different sets of data much easier.
Thank you so much. There's also a very interesting question around how a lot of emphasis is right now in the current situation being given to process automation. In terms of how would process discovery aid in identifying process automation? Is there a connection? A lot of RPA tools are boosting about this in the current scenario. So any thoughts on that?
So, Ian, you want to take the one?
No, I mean, I was going to say, I mean, obviously, by seeing the process, both from a system perspective and from a task flow perspective, there'll be candidates that jump out as being candidates for automation. So a lot of those might be high repetitive tasks, very low, very low variations in scenarios and very low variation in business rules, or where there are very known business rules. You can also start to run this sort of analysis across the system performance and see where there might be things within a system that need to be changed. But certainly very, very easy to see candidates for automation. Candidates where we might simply just need more business rules to be defined, as opposed to necessarily automating a process, or it might be simply that those rules can be automated, but the automated discovery and starting to look at variances can give you a very quick idea about where to automate. Marcello?
Are we actually seeing a lot of transition to automation in the current scenario? Is that a trend?
Well, yes is the simple answer. I think as businesses become more complex, as things go more and more online, and there's a drive for straight through processing or one touch, applications, those sort of things. There's a lot more automation and AI being put into not only completing a process, but also then starting to automate and straight through validations of applications and things like that, so that the quality of what comes in starts to help the back end of a process become much more efficient. But in my view, yes.
Thank you. I think as a last question, it would be great to get your recommendations on any textbooks which might be out there, which might present cases from different industries for predictive modeling, monitoring dashboards, and also on process mining.
Yes, so there is a well-known book by Wil van der Aalst, who's believed to be, it's a Dutch professor believed to be the godfather of process mining, who initiated the academic research on process mining about 20 years ago. I was personally lucky enough to get Wil involved during my PhD back when I was in Brisbane at QT. And Wil wrote a very successful book called Process Mining, Data Science in Action. So that is a good starting point. Another starting point is our own book, Fundamentals of Business Process Management. There is a dedicated chapter on process mining and process monitoring, including predictive and prescriptive monitoring. And the audience is more business oriented there and less academic as opposed to Wil's book. And there is also a range of MOOCs, massive open online courses available. For example, Wil has his own MOOC on process mining that follows the structure of his book, as well as there are process mining MOOCs dedicated to specific industry sectors, for example, process mining in the healthcare sector. We can share the references over email together with the slides.
That would be great. All right, thank you. I think it was a fabulous session. It was lovely to be hosting you both. I'll hand over to Helene to give us the closing remarks.
Hi, thank you. That was very informative. I reflected that had I known more about this a couple of months ago, I might have done things a little bit differently, followed a very manual process to get to the end result of seeing how many times things occurred in a process. So it's good to see these tools out there that can help us do this in a simpler way, even if there is data kind of scrubbing that you'd need to do to get to the point that you need to do. I still think you would save a lot of time. Thank you very much, Ian and Marcello. Just in final, before we wrap up, thank you for your attendance tonight, and just highlighting that there are the next event is Influencing Business Stakeholders, which will take place on the 17th of June. It is a presentation by Andrew Murphy, and we also have Going Apeshit, Becoming a Master Influencer. by Full Slate the 1st of July. If I can recommend anything that you go to, going to have a look at what Full Slate has to present. It is an absolute amazing talk. It's one I refer to still on a daily basis. That's how good it is. I still think about it, and I still even talk about it to other people, and it's really a good presentation to watch. Thank you for your attendance, and hope to see you again soon on webinar. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for your attention. Good night.